The steak arrived on a white porcelain plate every evening at 6:30, sliced thin as communion wafers, tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Adelia Vaughn served it with boiled potatoes and canned peas, and the men from the railway depot ate in silence, their forks scraping china in a rhythm that sounded almost like prayer. Outside, the autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and something else, something sweet and wrong that made dogs refuse to walk past the cafe's back door. This was Carlyle, Illinois, in 1910, and every butcher shop within 30 miles had been out of beef for 6 weeks. But Adelia's cafe never ran short. The widow kept her kitchen door locked, her icebox covered with a tarp, and her ledger hidden in a flour sack beneath the counter. When the railway inspector finally forced that lock on November 14th, he found 23 pounds of meat wrapped in cheesecloth, each package marked with a name, a date, and a single word that made him vomit into the alley. The word was pork. The Illinois Central Railway Depot sat at the eastern edge of Carlyle like a gray tooth, its paint peeling in strips that revealed older paint beneath, layers going back to the depot's construction in 1872. The waiting room smelled of coal dust and wet wool, the ticket window framed by schedules printed on yellow paper that curled at the edges. 3 trains stopped daily, morning, noon, and evening, carrying passengers between St. Louis and Mattoon, and the depot cafe fed whoever stepped off with an hour to kill before the next connection. Adelia Vaughn had run the cafe since March of 1908, when her husband Thomas died from blood poisoning after cutting his hand on a rusted brake lever. The railway company offered her the cafe lease as a form of widow's pension, $20 a month against whatever she could earn from feeding travelers and depot workers. She was 34 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair she kept pinned in a tight bun and hands that were always raw from lye soap and scalding water. She never smiled, but she never raised her voice either, and the men who ate at her counter said she ran a clean establishment with fair portions and no nonsense. The cafe occupied a narrow building adjacent to the depot, a single room with a counter, 8 stools, and a kitchen separated by a curtain of yellowed muslin. A wood stove provided heat and cooking fire. Shelves held canned goods, flour, salt, sugar, and coffee. The icebox stood against the back wall, a zinc-lined chest that required daily blocks hauled from the ice house 3 streets over. Adelia kept everything orderly, the counter scrubbed twice a day, the floor swept after every meal, the dishes washed and stacked before she walked the 6 blocks home to the boarding house where she rented a room above a seamstress shop. The menu varied little. Breakfast meant eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch offered soup and sandwiches, but dinner, served only on weekdays to catch the evening train crowd, always featured a meat dish, usually pork chops or fried chicken, occasionally ham when the butcher shop on Main Street had extra. The prices were modest, 10 cents for breakfast, 15 for lunch, a quarter for dinner, and most days Adelia cleared enough to pay her rent and put aside a few dollars toward the debt Thomas had left behind. Loans from men whose patience was measured in months, not years. Then came September of 1910, and the cattle began dying. It started in Missouri, across the Mississippi River, a fever that swept through herds with the speed of wildfire, killing cows and steers within 48 hours of the first symptoms. By mid-September, the fever had crossed into Illinois, moving up the Kaskaskia River Valley like a living thing. Farmers shot their infected animals and burned the carcasses in pits dug beyond the property lines, the smoke visible for miles. The state veterinarian arrived from Springfield with quarantine orders, but the fever moved faster than paperwork, and by October 1st, Every county from Madison to Fayette had lost at least a third of its cattle. The butcher shops ran dry within a week. Beef vanished from dinner tables across southern Illinois, replaced by pork, chicken, and an increasing reliance on canned goods shipped from Chicago. Prices rose, tempers frayed. Farmers whose herds had survived the fever refused to sell, afraid of what the next month might bring. The Railway Depot Café, like every other establishment that served food, adjusted its menu accordingly. Pork chops became a staple. Chicken appeared twice a week. Beef simply disappeared, except at Adelia's table. On October 7, 1910, Adelia Vaughn served steak for dinner. The men who ate it, 3 railway workers and a traveling salesman from Effingham, remarked on its quality. Tender, well-marbled, cooked in butter with a crust of black pepper. They asked where she'd gotten it, and Adelia said only that she'd had a small reserve in her icebox, put aside before the shortage began. The men nodded and ate, grateful for a proper meal after weeks of salt pork and beans. The next night, she served steak again, and the night after that. Walter Pruitt kept records the way other men kept grudges, carefully, methodically, with an attention to detail that made him useful to the railway company and deeply unpopular among the depot staff. He was 38 years old, unmarried, living in a company-owned house near the switching yard, and his job was to ensure that all railway-adjacent businesses complied with the health and safety regulations outlined in the Illinois Central Railway Employee and Vendor Standards Manual, a document he carried everywhere in a leather satchel that smelled of machine oil and ink. Pruitt ate dinner at the Depot Café 4 nights a week, always arriving at 6:15, 15 minutes before the evening train, always ordering whatever Adelia had prepared, always paying exact change from a small cloth purse he kept in his vest pocket. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a mustache he trimmed every Sunday with sewing scissors, and he had the kind of face that people forgot the moment he left a room. He spoke rarely, ate quickly, and made notes in a small brown notebook that he kept in his jacket's inner pocket. On October 9th, Pruitt's notebook entry read, "Vaughn Café, dinner service, 6:30 p.m., steak with potatoes and peas, 25 cents, quality excellent, origin of beef unexplained given county-wide shortage, notation for follow-up inquiry." He had asked Adelia directly where she was obtaining fresh beef when every butcher shop in Carlyle had been out of stock for over a week. She had smiled, a rare expression that didn't reach her eyes, and said she had arrangements with a supplier in Vandalia who owed her late husband a favor. Pruitt had noted this in his book, along with the observation that Vandalia was 40 miles north and also under cattle quarantine. By October 15th, Pruitt's suspicion had hardened into certainty that something was wrong. Adelia had served steak 6 nights in a row, and no delivery wagons had stopped at the cafe. He had watched from his office window, which overlooked the depot platform and the cafe's front entrance. No crates had been unloaded from the trains. No butcher's boy had made a delivery. Yet the meat kept appearing, and the men kept eating, and Adelia kept her kitchen curtain drawn and her icebox locked with a padlock she wore on a chain around her neck. Pruitt was not a man given to dramatic action. He preferred procedure, forms filed in triplicate, official inquiries made through proper channels. But he was also responsible for ensuring that nothing served at the Depot Café would sicken passengers or create liability for the railway company. And the locked icebox bothered him. Food storage areas were supposed to be accessible for inspection at any time, a rule Adelia knew perfectly well because Pruitt himself had explained it when she first took over the café lease. On October 17th, he filed a formal inspection request with the depot manager, citing Section 12 of the Health Standards Manual. The manager, a florid man named Kimball, who had worked for the railway since 1892, signed the request without reading it and told Pruitt to handle it however he saw fit. "Just don't cause trouble," Kimball added. "The widows had a rough time and the men like eating there." 3 weeks passed before Pruitt acted. He was a methodical man, after all. Margaret Denton had lived above her seamstress shop on Market Street for 19 years, ever since her husband died in a thresher accident that left her a widow at 23 with a trade and no children. She took in sewing, mostly women's dresses and alterations, but also mending for the railway workers who needed torn jackets patched or missing buttons replaced. Her rooms were small and neat, the front serving as her workshop with a treadle sewing machine by the window, the back divided into a bedroom and a kitchen that she rarely used because arthritis made standing over a stove painful. Adelia Vaughn rented the room next to Margaret's, a narrow space with a bed, a washstand, a chair, and a shelf for books. The two women shared a privy in the back courtyard and a coal stove in the hallway. They were not friends, exactly, but they had lived adjacent to one another for 2 years, and a kind of careful familiarity had developed. Greetings exchanged in the morning, brief conversations about weather or the price of fabric or the quality of the coal delivery. Margaret noticed when Adelia began coming home later each night. Previously, the widow had returned by 8 o'clock, closing the cafe after serving the evening train passengers and washing the dishes before walking home through streets that emptied once the depot shut down. But starting in early October, Adelia's footsteps on the stairs didn't sound until 10 or 11, sometimes later, and Margaret, who slept poorly and heard every creak in the old building, wondered what kept the widow at the cafe for those extra hours. She also noticed the smell. It began in mid-October, a faint sweetness that seeped through the walls between their rooms, strongest in the early morning hours when the building was silent, and Margaret lay awake listening to the sounds of mice in the walls. It was not unpleasant, exactly, but it was wrong. The way milk smells wrong when it's turned, or the way meat smells when it's been left too long in summer heat. Margaret mentioned it once, casually, when she and Adelia passed in the hallway, and Adelia had said only that she'd been using a new soap for washing her work clothes, something with lye and rose oil that the druggist had recommended. But the smell wasn't soap. Margaret knew soap. She'd been washing and pressing fabric her entire adult life, and no soap smelled like that. No soap left a residue that seemed to cling to the air even after Adelia had gone to work, a sweetness that made Margaret's stomach turn when she breathed it too deeply. On November 2nd, Margaret saw Adelia carry something up the stairs wrapped in a canvas sack. It was late, past 11, and Margaret had been sitting by her window doing handwork by lamplight when she heard the street door open below. She set down her sewing and moved to the doorway, listening as Adelia climbed the stairs slowly, as if carrying something heavy. When Adelia reached the landing, Margaret opened her door just enough to see through the crack. The canvas sack was dark with moisture, and something inside it shifted as Adelia fumbled with her key. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Adelia's face was pale, her expression flat and unreadable. She said nothing, only unlocked her door and slipped inside, and Margaret heard the scrape of a bolt being drawn. The next morning, Margaret went to see Father Donahue at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The depot workers formed a small society of men whose lives revolved around the arrival and departure of trains, a rhythm that structured their days more reliably than any clock. They were switchmen, brakemen, and maintenance crew, 18 men in total who worked overlapping shifts to keep the Illinois Central running through Carlyle without delay. Most lived in boarding houses near the rail yard, married men with families renting small houses on the east side of town where rents were cheap and the noise from the trains was constant enough to become invisible. They ate breakfast at home, packed lunches from their wives' kitchens, and took dinner at the depot café when their shifts ended during evening hours. Adelia's café had become a ritual, a place where they could sit for 30 minutes before heading home, eating hot food and reading day-old newspapers left by travelers. The café was neutral ground, free from the small politics of the yard, the foreman's moods, the constant jockeying for better assignments. When Adelia began serving steak regularly, the men accepted it as a stroke of good fortune. She'd found a supplier, they reasoned, someone with a private herd unaffected by the fever. Perhaps a farmer paying off a debt to her late husband. Perhaps a cousin in another county. The specifics didn't matter. The steak was good, the price hadn't increased, and after weeks of eating beans and salt pork at home, a proper meal at the depot felt like a small mercy. Frank Holloway, a brakeman who'd worked the line for 12 years, brought his son to the café on October 22nd. The boy was 16, rail-thin and eager to impress, hoping to land a position with the company once he turned 17. Frank ordered 2 dinners, both steak, and watched his son eat with the intensity of someone tasting beef for the first time in months. "Where's she getting it?" the boy asked between bites, and Frank shrugged. "Don't ask questions when you're lucky," he said. But the question had begun circulating through the depot, quietly in the way that rumors move through small communities, not spoken aloud, but present in glances and half-finished sentences. No shipments arrived. No butcher claimed to be supplying her. And yet the meat kept coming, night after night, tender and fresh, never frozen, never tasting of preservatives. Some of the men stopped eating there. Not many, 3 or 4 out of the regular dozen, men whose wives had heard whispers and insisted their husbands bring dinner home instead. They offered no explanation, simply nodded to Adelia when they passed the café and kept walking. The others continued eating, and if they noticed the departures, they said nothing. Complicity tastes like good food when you're hungry. Father Donahue had served St. Mary's Parish for 11 years, arriving in Carlyle in 1899 fresh from seminary in Chicago, young and earnest, and convinced that rural ministry would be simpler than the urban chaos he'd witnessed during his training. He'd learned otherwise quickly. Small-town faith was complicated by proximity. Everyone knew everyone's sins, and the confessional offered less privacy than he'd been taught to expect. Margaret Denton came to the church on the morning of November 3rd, not for Mass, which wouldn't be said until Sunday, but for a conversation she couldn't have in the boarding house where walls were thin and neighbors listened. She found Father Donahue in the sacristy, folding altar linens, and asked if he had a moment to speak privately. They sat in the front pew, the church dim and cold, the smell of incense lingering from Sunday's service. Margaret was not a woman given to hysteria or gossip. She worked hard, attended Mass faithfully, and kept her own counsel. So when she told Father Donahue that something was wrong with Adelia Vaughn, he listened carefully. "She's bringing something home late at night," Margaret said, her voice low despite the empty church. "Wrapped in canvas, heavy, and there's a smell in her room. Something sweet that makes me feel sick when I breathe it." Father Donahue asked the obvious question. Had Margaret spoken to Adelia directly about her concerns? "I don't want to speak to her," Margaret replied. "I want to know what I should do. If I should tell someone. The sheriff, maybe." The priest considered this. He was 41 years old enough to have seen how small towns handled accusations against widows who lived on the margins of respectability. "What do you think she's doing?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then said, I think she's stealing meat from somewhere, and I think she's serving it at the cafe. Stealing from where? I don't know. Father Donahue folded his hands in his lap. Has anyone become ill from eating at the cafe? Not that I've heard. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we should be slow to judge. Times are hard. The widow is doing what she must to survive. But Margaret was not satisfied. It's not just about theft, Father. It's about the smell and the way she looks when I see her on the stairs late at night. Like she's done something terrible and knows it. The priest promised to visit Adelia, to check on her welfare, and perhaps gently inquire about her circumstances. Margaret thanked him and left, walking back through the cold morning to her shop, where a pile of mending waited on her work table. Father Donahue kept his promise. He visited the cafe on November 4th, arriving during the afternoon lull when no trains were due and the counter stood empty. Adelia was cleaning the stove, her sleeves rolled up, her hair damp with steam. She offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at the counter making small talk about the parish, the weather, the cattle fever that had disrupted everyone's routines. He did not mention Margaret's visit. He did not ask about the source of Adelia's meat supply. Instead, he offered the church's assistance if she needed help with rent or debts, a standing offer the parish extended to widows in difficult circumstances. Adelia thanked him, said she was managing, and showed him to the door with the same unreadable expression she wore when serving dinner. As he walked back to the church, Father Donahue told himself he'd done what he could. Adelia kept her accounts in a leather-bound ledger, 8 inches by 10, its pages ruled in blue ink that had faded over time. She'd inherited it from Thomas, who'd used it to track his work hours and expenses before the blood poisoning took him. After his death, she'd crossed out his entries and begun her own, recording every penny earned and spent at the cafe, columns for income, food costs, fuel, rent, and the debt payments she made monthly to 3 different creditors who held notes Thomas had signed for reasons she'd never fully understood. The ledger lived in a flour sack beneath the counter, hidden where no casual observer would notice it. Adelia was careful about money, not from greed, but from necessity, and she knew exactly how much she needed to earn each week to keep the cafe running and her creditors patient. The cattle fever had threatened that balance. Without beef, she'd had to rely on cheaper proteins that brought in less profit, and the gap between income and expenses had begun to widen in ways that frightened her. Then, in late September, an opportunity had presented itself. There is a moment in every crime when the perpetrator must decide whether the risk justifies the reward, whether survival outweighs morality, whether desperation can be weaponized into action. For Adelia, that moment arrived on September 26, 1910, when Samuel Teague, a traveling salesman from Centralia, collapsed on the train platform after suffering what the depot doctor called an apoplectic fit. He died within the hour, his body carried to the undertaker's parlor on Market Street, while his luggage sat unclaimed on the depot floor. Adelia was not present when Teague died. She heard about it from the depot workers who came in for coffee that afternoon, speaking in hushed tones about the suddenness of death, the way a man could be alive one moment and gone the next. She listened, offered her condolences, and thought about Thomas, who died just as quickly from an infection that should have been preventable. That night, after the cafe closed, Adelia walked to the undertaker's parlor and spoke with William Marsh, who'd been preparing bodies in Carlyle for 33 years. She asked if Teague had any family, anyone to claim the body. Marsh said the railway company was trying to locate relatives, but so far, no one had responded to the telegrams. If no one came forward within a week, Teague would be buried in the town cemetery at county expense, a pauper's funeral with no marker. Adelia made Marsh an offer. She would pay for a proper burial, a casket, and a stone if Marsh would allow her to purchase certain portions of the body for medical purposes. She explained that she'd been corresponding with a doctor in St. Louis who was conducting research on tissue preservation and had offered to pay for samples if she could obtain them discreetly. It was a lie, of course, but it was a convincing lie, delivered by a widow whose respectability was unquestioned, and Marsh, who earned little enough that $50 was a meaningful sum, agreed. The ledger recorded the transaction in Adelia's careful handwriting. September 28th, special purchase, $50, tissue samples acquired for medical research purposes. The truth was simpler and more monstrous. The icebox stood against the cafe's back wall, a zinc-lined chest 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 30 inches tall, with a hinged lid that opened from the top. Adelia had added the padlock in early October, shortly after she began serving steak regularly, and she kept the key on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her blouse where it rested cold against her skin. The lock was not unusual. Many food vendors locked their storage to prevent theft, particularly when goods were expensive or scarce. But Adelia had also draped the icebox with a canvas tarp, covering it completely so that even the shape was obscured. And this detail struck Walter Pruitt as excessive when he finally stood in the cafe's back room on November 14th, armed with his inspection authorization and a crowbar borrowed from the depot maintenance shed. Kimball, the depot manager, had accompanied Pruitt reluctantly, motivated less by concern for railway regulations than by a desire to ensure that whatever Pruitt discovered didn't create unnecessary scandal. "Be quick about it," Kimball said, standing in the doorway while Pruitt approached the covered icebox. "And for God's sake, be discreet." Pruitt removed the tarp carefully, folding it and setting it aside. The icebox itself was unremarkable, its zinc lining showing signs of wear but no obvious contamination. The padlock was sturdy, a Yale model that required bolt cutters to remove. Pruitt had brought those as well, and with 2 sharp cuts, the lock fell away, and the icebox lid lifted on hinges that needed oil. The smell arrived first, sweet and cloying, with an undertone of iron and something else. Something that reminded Pruitt of the rendering plant on the edge of town where animal carcasses were boiled down to make soap and glue. Kimball stepped back, one hand over his mouth, and said, "Christ." Inside the icebox, wrapped in cheesecloth and arranged in neat rows, were 23 packages of meat. Each package was labeled with a strip of paper tied with butcher's twine. The labels were written in Adelia's handwriting, precise and even, each one noting a name, a date, and a single word. Samuel Teague, September 28, pork. Pork. When a community discovers that one of its own has committed an act so transgressive that it threatens the social fabric, a choice must be made. The truth can be acknowledged, investigated, and punished according to law, or it can be suppressed, managed, and buried beneath a collective agreement to forget. Small towns, where everyone's reputation is currency and scandal spreads faster than disease, often choose the latter. What would you do if you'd eaten meat that couldn't be named? If you'd sat at a counter 4 nights a week, paid your quarter, cleaned your plate, and felt grateful for the meal? If you'd fed that meat to your son and told him to be thankful for their good fortune? Walter Pruitt stood in the cafe's back room, staring at the contents of the icebox, and tried to understand what he was seeing. The labels made no sense. Samuel Teague was the salesman who died on the platform in late September. But the others, the names on the remaining 22 packages, he didn't recognize them. And the word pork, used consistently on every label, was clearly a code, a way for Adelia to track inventory without writing what the packages actually contained. "We need to find her," Kimball said, his voice shaking. "Right now." Adelia Vaughn had not appeared for the evening dinner service. The cafe's front door was locked, the counter stools empty, the coffee pot cold. Pruitt had discovered this when he arrived at 6 o'clock with his inspection authorization, and after waiting 30 minutes, he'd used his authority as a railway inspector to force entry through the back door, which opened into the narrow room where the icebox waited beneath its tarp. They found Adelia in her room at the boarding house 2 hours later, after the sheriff had been summoned and a search organized. She was sitting on her bed, fully dressed, her hands folded in her lap, the key to the icebox still on its chain around her neck. She did not resist when the sheriff arrested her. She did not speak, did not weep, did not offer explanation or excuse. She simply stood, allowed herself to be led downstairs, and climbed into the sheriff's wagon with the mechanical compliance of someone who'd been expecting this moment for weeks. Margaret Denton watched from her window as the wagon pulled away. She'd seen the sheriff arrive, seen Pruitt and Kimball and 3 deputies enter the building, heard the footsteps on the stairs and the low voices speaking in tones that suggested catastrophe. She knew, without being told, that her suspicions had been confirmed, that the smell in Adelia's room had been exactly what Margaret feared. And she wondered, as the wagon disappeared toward the county jail, whether she'd done the right thing by speaking to Father Donahue, whether some truths were better left unspoken. William Marsh had been in the death business long enough to recognize when cooperation was the wiser course. The sheriff arrived at his parlor on the evening of November 14th, accompanied by a deputy and a county prosecutor named Lewin, who'd made the 40-mile trip from Hillsborough after receiving a telegram about the Café discovery. They asked Marsh direct questions about his dealings with Adelia Vaughn, and Marsh, who had no desire to be charged as an accomplice to whatever Adelia had done, answered honestly. Yes, he'd sold portions of Samuel Teague's body to Adelia in late September. She'd claimed she was procuring them for medical research. He'd believed her because she was a respectable widow, and the story seemed plausible. The transaction had involved tissue from the thigh and upper arm, approximately 15 pounds total, for which Adelia had paid $50 cash. Marsh had documented the sale in his business ledger, a fact that saved him from criminal charges later. "Who else?" Lewin asked. "Teague can't account for 23 packages." Marsh consulted his records. Between September 26th and November 10th, 5 individuals had died in Carlyle or passed through the depot before expiring at locations where their bodies were returned to Marsh's parlor for preparation. Samuel Teague, the salesman. Harriet Cole, an elderly woman who died of influenza. Jacob Pruitt, no relation to Walter, a drifter found frozen beside the tracks. Martin Cross, a railway worker killed in a switching accident. And Anne Dougherty, a child of 7 who'd succumbed to diphtheria. "Did you sell tissue from all of them?" the sheriff asked, his voice tight. Marsh hesitated, then nodded. "Mrs. Vaughn approached me after each death. I thought she was genuinely assisting medical science. She paid fair prices, and the families were never told because most couldn't afford funerals anyway." "You cut up a child and sold the meat," Lewin said flatly. "I didn't know," Marsh replied. "I swear to God, I didn't know what she was doing with it." The prosecutor made notes in a leather portfolio. "These 5 bodies account for, 70 pounds of tissue, She had 23 packages. What's the rest? The room went silent. Marsh had no answer. The sheriff looked at the deputy, who shrugged. Lewin closed his portfolio and said, "We need to talk to everyone who's died in this county since September. Everyone buried, everyone cremated. We need to find out if Marsh is lying." But Marsh wasn't lying. The records were clear. 5 bodies, 70 pounds of tissue, $50 per transaction. The remaining packages in Adelia's icebox, the ones not accounted for by Marsh's sales, came from somewhere else, and that somewhere would take 3 days to discover. Adelia Vaughn did not confess. She sat in the county jail, a single cell with a cot and a bucket, and said nothing when Lewin questioned her. She did not deny the meat in the icebox. She did not explain the labels. She did not name her accomplices or describe her methods. She simply sat, hands folded, eyes fixed on the far wall, and waited for whatever came next. Her silence infuriated Lewin, who'd prosecuted enough criminals to know that a confession would simplify the trial and ensure conviction. Without it, he'd have to rely on circumstantial evidence, the icebox contents, Marsh's testimony, the testimony of men who'd eaten at the cafe and could describe the steak's unusual tenderness. It was damning, certainly, but silence left room for doubt, and doubt could be weaponized by a clever defense attorney. Not that Adelia would have a clever attorney. She had no money for a lawyer, and the court would appoint someone, likely a young man from Hillsborough with minimal experience and no enthusiasm for defending a woman accused of serving human flesh to railway workers. On the 3rd day of her incarceration, Father Donahue visited the jail and asked to speak with Adelia privately. The sheriff allowed it, and the priest sat on a wooden chair outside the cell while Adelia remained on her cot, silent as stone. "Why did you do it?" Father Donahue asked, his voice low. Adelia looked at him for the first time since her arrest. Her expression was not defiant or ashamed. It was simply empty. "Because I was hungry," she said, "and I had debts. You could have asked for help. The church would have assisted you." "Charity doesn't pay creditors, Father, and debts don't wait for mercy." Father Donahue wanted to offer absolution, to guide her toward repentance and prayer. But looking at Adelia's face, he realized she felt no remorse, only exhaustion. She'd done what she believed necessary to survive, and whatever moral boundaries she'd crossed had been crossed with full awareness of their weight. "Did you kill anyone?" he asked, "to obtain the meat?" "No," Adelia said. "They were already dead." It was the truth, but it was also inadequate. The question wasn't whether she'd killed, but whether she'd transformed death into commodity, whether she'd treated human remains as inventory to be butchered and sold. And that question had no answer that would satisfy either the law or the church. The revelation that Adelia Vaughn had been serving human flesh hit Carlyle like a thunderclap. The story appeared in the Carlyle Union banner on November 17th under a headline that read, "Depot Café Horror. Widow served dead to living." The article, written by the paper's editor and only full-time reporter, Horace Finch, laid out the facts with a sensational breathlessness that sold out the paper's entire print run within hours. The railway men who'd eaten at the cafe reacted with varying degrees of horror and denial. Some refused to believe it, insisting that the meat had been beef, that there'd been some mistake, that the whole story was a fabrication designed to ruin a widow's reputation. Others became physically ill, vomiting in alleys and train yards, unable to shake the knowledge of what they'd consumed. Frank Holloway, the brakeman who'd brought his son to the cafe in October, took 3 days off work and didn't leave his house. A few men, a very few, said nothing at all. They'd suspected something was wrong. They admitted privately to their wives or to each other in whispered conversations. The meat had tasted different. Not bad, but different. And the fact that no shipments ever arrived should have been a warning. But they'd eaten anyway because the steak was good, and the price was fair, and they'd convinced themselves that asking questions would only spoil the meal. Complicity doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, one ignored suspicion at a time. The Illinois Central Railway Company moved quickly to distance itself from the scandal. Kimball, the depot manager, released a statement claiming that the café operated independently of the railway and that all inspections had been conducted according to company standards. Walter Pruitt, who'd filed the inspection request that led to the discovery, was quietly transferred to a depot in southern Indiana, a lateral move that removed him from Carlyle before he could testify at trial. The café itself was shuttered, its windows boarded, the counter and stools removed and burned. The building would remain empty for 2 years before being torn down entirely. The lot sold to a hardware merchant who built a storehouse and never mentioned what had occupied the space before. The mystery of the unaccounted packages was solved on November 20th, when a farmer named Dutch Kohler came forward with information he'd been holding for 3 weeks. Kohler owned a small property 12 miles south of Carlyle, a hardscrabble operation that barely supported his family. He supplemented his income by doing odd jobs, and in late October, a man from Carlyle had hired him to butcher and dress what he claimed was a hog that had died of natural causes. The man's name was Robert Kern, a laborer who lived in a shack near the rail yard. The hog had been a vagrant who died of exposure beside the tracks, his body discovered by Kern and dragged to Kohler's farm under cover of darkness. Kern had paid Kohler $20 to process the remains, and Kohler, who'd butchered hogs his entire life and knew the difference between porcine and human anatomy, had done the work anyway, because $20 was more than he'd earn in a month. He delivered 40 pounds of meat to Kern, wrapped in cheesecloth, and Kern had sold it to Adelia for $50, a tidy profit that he'd used to pay back rent and buy whiskey. When the café scandal broke, Kern fled Carlyle on a southbound train, and as of the trial's start, he had not been located. Kohler was arrested and charged as an accessory. His defense was simple. He'd needed the money, he hadn't asked questions, and the man who'd hired him had assured him everything was legal. The jury, presented with a farmer who'd butchered one body versus a widow who'd served 23 packages, convicted Kohler of improper handling of human remains and sentenced him to 6 months in the county workhouse. The full scope of Adelia's operation was never entirely clear. 5 bodies from Marsh, 1 from Kern via Kohler, and the remaining packages remained unexplained, though investigators suspected she'd obtained tissue from 2 more sources: a gravedigger who'd been paid to exhume recent burials and a hospital orderly in Vandalia who'd been dismissed for theft shortly after Adelia's arrest. Neither individual was charged, and their involvement remained circumstantial. What was clear, and what the prosecution hammered home during the trial, was that Adelia Vaughn had systematically acquired human remains, processed them in her café kitchen, and served them to unsuspecting customers for 6 weeks, earning over $300 in the process and paying down nearly half her debts. The trial lasted 4 days. The courtroom in Hillsborough was packed for all 4 days of the trial, spectators filling every bench and standing along the back wall, drawn by the lurid nature of the charges and the opportunity to witness a scandal that would be discussed for decades. The prosecution presented its case with clinical precision. The icebox contents, the labels, Marsh's testimony, The testimony of railway men who'd eaten the steak. The financial records showing Adelia's debt payments. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney named Samuel Phelps, argued that Adelia had been driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. A widow with debts left by a deceased husband, no family support, and a community that offered charity but no real assistance. He emphasized that she'd killed no one, that all the tissue came from individuals already deceased, and that her actions, while disturbing, should be understood as survival rather than malice. The jury was unimpressed. 12 men from Montgomery County, farmers and shopkeepers who'd never met Adelia but understood the violation she represented, deliberated for 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Desecration of human remains, operating a food establishment under false pretenses, and defrauding customers. The judge, a stern man named Whitaker, who'd presided over the circuit court for 18 years, sentenced her to 15 years in the state penitentiary at Joliet. Adelia showed no reaction when the sentence was read. She stood, hands folded, face expressionless, and was led from the courtroom by 2 deputies who escorted her to the county jail to await transport north. The newspaper coverage was extensive. The Chicago Tribune ran the story on page 3, describing the horror in downstate Café with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Smaller papers across Illinois reprinted the article, adding their own editorials about the moral decay of rural communities and the desperation that poverty could inspire. Some writers condemned Adelia as a monster. Others, a minority, noted the systemic failures that had left a widow with no options but crime. Adelia served 11 years of her sentence before dying of pneumonia in December 1921. She never spoke publicly about the Café, never granted interviews, never sought pardon or early release. Her body was buried in the prison cemetery with no marker. The town of Carlyle did what most communities do when confronted with collective shame. It forgot. The Café was demolished, the icebox destroyed, the newspapers archived and rarely consulted. Within 5 years, the story had become something people mentioned in hushed tones, if at all, a local tragedy best left in the past. Walter Pruitt never returned to Carlyle. He worked for the railway in Indiana until 1938, retiring with a pension and a reputation as a meticulous inspector who never overlooked details. He kept his notebook from 1910 until his death in 1946. The entries about Adelia's Café preserved in careful handwriting, a record of the moment he discovered something he wished he hadn't. Margaret Denton continued her seamstress work until arthritis made sewing impossible. She never rented the room next to hers again, preferring to keep it empty rather than risk another tenant whose secrets might seep through the walls. She died in 1933, and her funeral was attended by most of the women in Carlyle, who remembered her as a skilled seamstress and a faithful churchgoer, and never mentioned that she'd been the one to alert Father Donahue. Father Donahue served St. Mary's until 1928, when failing health forced him to retire to a monastery in Missouri. He never spoke publicly about his visit to the Café or his conversation with Adelia in the county jail, though his private papers, discovered after his death, included a letter he'd written but never sent to the bishop, describing his failure to act decisively when warned about the widow's strange behavior. Frank Holloway, the brakeman, left the railway in 1912 and moved his family to Springfield, where he worked in a factory making farm equipment. He never ate in a restaurant again, preparing all his meals at home, and when his son asked him years later why he avoided dining out, Frank said only that he'd learned not to trust food he hadn't seen prepared. The railway depot continued operating until 1959, when declining passenger traffic made it economically unviable. The building was torn down, and a gas station was built on the site. The station operated until 1982, when the interstate bypass made it obsolete. Today, the lot is empty, covered in gravel, used occasionally for overflow parking during county fairs. The story of Adelia Vaughn and the Depot Café lives on in fragments. Local historians mention it in footnotes, cautiously, as an example of the extremes poverty could drive in early 20th century rural America. True crime enthusiasts discover it periodically, writing blog posts and forum threads that speculate about the unaccounted packages and the possibility that more victims existed than were ever documented. Old-timers in Carlyle, the few who remember hearing the story from grandparents, will sometimes mention the cafe when asked about the town's history, though they're careful to note that no one alive today ate there, and the whole affair happened so long ago that it barely seems real. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind comes from the east and carries the smell of coal smoke from the old rail yard, people walking past the empty lot where the cafe once stood claim they catch a whiff of something sweet and wrong, something that makes them walk a little faster and avoid looking too closely at the gravel where the foundation used to be. On those nights, if you're listening carefully, you might almost hear the scrape of forks on china, the murmur of men eating in silence, and the sound of a lock clicking shut on an icebox that should have stayed closed. Some doors, once opened, never fully close, and some hungers echo longer than memory. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.